Before you scroll past this, I want you to look at one thing. Look at this map. The edges are burned, the corners are torn, the ink has faded to the color of dried blood. It looks like something that should have been thrown away 1,000 years ago. But it wasn't thrown away. It was hidden. And there's a difference. Because on this map, 12 roads leave a single city. 12 roads, 12 families, 12 bloodlines, and every one of them belongs to a story that somebody, somewhere, decided you were better off never hearing. So here's the question I want you to sit with for the next few minutes. The question that has kept scholars arguing, kept nations rewriting their history books, and kept ordinary people up at night once they finally saw it. If you could take the 12 tribes of Israel, the actual bloodline, the actual family described in the oldest documents on earth, and trace every single one of them across a real map of the ancient world, where would all 12 roads lead? And why would anyone spend centuries making sure that map was never put together? Because that's the part almost nobody talks about. Piece by piece, the trail survives. A verse here, a name on a monument there, a migration route, a record buried in an archive. On their own, they look like scattered dots, harmless, forgettable. But when you connect the dots, when you finally lay all 12 roads on the same page, a shape appears. And the shape points south. It points to Africa. Now, before you decide whether that sounds impossible or obvious or somewhere in between, stay with me, because I'm not going to ask you to believe anything on faith. I'm going to show you the receipts, the named documents, the places you can still point to on a map today. And by the end, you're going to see the one map that no single video has ever assembled in one place, the map they hid. And if this is the story of your family, and it may be, you're going to feel it before I even finish the sentence. So let's open it up. Let me start with something simple, because a lot of this story got complicated on purpose. Israel was never one place with one people who stayed put. Israel was 12 tribes, 12 extended families descended from 12 brothers, spread across a strip of land, each with its own territory, its own borders, its own character. Reuben and Gad and half of Manasseh out east, across the Jordan River. Judah and Simeon and Benjamin down south. Ephraim in the center. Dan, Naphtali, Asher, Zebulun, and Issachar, spreading north toward the mountains and the sea. 12 families, one nation on paper, but already, even then, pulling in different directions. And then that nation cracked in half. This is the moment everything turns, so let me slow down. The kingdom split into two. In the south, you had Judah, that's Judah, Benjamin, and the priestly tribe of Levi mixed in. In the north, you had the other 10 tribes, and they kept the name Israel. 2 kingdoms, same family, different fates. And the northern kingdom, those 10 tribes, is where the phrase you've probably heard comes from, the 10 lost tribes. Lost. Think about that word for a second. You don't lose 10 tribes. 10 tribes don't vanish into thin air. People vanish when someone comes and takes them. And that's exactly what the record says happened. So here's the first receipt, and it's not a rumor or a legend, it's a documented conquest. Open the second book of Kings, chapter 17. It describes the fall of the northern kingdom to the empire of Assyria, one of the most ruthless war machines the ancient world ever produced. Assyria didn't just beat you, Assyria emptied you. Their whole strategy was deportation. They would march a conquered people off their land, scatter them across the empire, and move strangers in behind them so nobody could ever go home again. That's what happened to the 10 northern tribes. Taken, marched off, scattered. Now, and I want to be straight with you, the record says the first wave of that deportation went east, into the heart of Assyria, toward Mesopotamia, toward the land of the Medes, in the region we'd point to today as Iraq and Iran. That's where the paper trail starts, east. So how does a story that begins by going east end up pointing south, to Africa? Hold that question, because the answer is the whole map, and the next receipt is where it starts to bend. But first, the north was taken, 10 tribes, gone from history's front page. So what about your tribe? If your line runs back to Ephraim or Manasseh or Dan or Naphtali, you're already in this story, and your ancestors were already on the road. Keep that in your pocket. We're coming back to you. Now let me hand you the receipt that changes the direction of the whole map. Isaiah chapter 11, verse 11. This is the one. If there's a single line at the center of everything I'm about to show you, this is it. Because Isaiah isn't speaking in vague poetry here. Isaiah names names. He describes a day when the scattered remnant of the people would be gathered back, and then he lists exactly where they'd be gathered from. Listen to the list. Assyria, that's the east, that fits the conquest we just talked about. But then Egypt, Pathros, which is Upper Egypt, the deep south of Egypt, further up the Nile. Cush, and Cush is the ancient name for the kingdom south of Egypt, the land of Nubia, stretching into what we'd call Sudan and Ethiopia today. Elam, out east again, and the islands of the sea. Read that list slowly, and something jumps out. Egypt, Pathros, Cush. That is not a list of places in the Middle East. That is a roadmap into Africa. The text itself, one of the most quoted, most preserved books in the entire ancient world, is telling you the scattered people would be found in Africa, not as a theory somebody invented last year, as a name on the page, written thousands of years ago. And here's where I have to be honest with you, because this channel doesn't do fairy tales. There's a difference between what the text says and what the text is claiming happened. Isaiah names Egypt, Pathros, and Cush. That part is on the page, and you can read it yourself tonight. What that means, how far it reaches, and who exactly ended up where, that's where the argument begins. Scholars have fought over it for generations. Some read it narrowly, some read it as the key to everything. I'm going to lay out the whole trail and let you decide which side you land on. Fair enough? Good, because the next receipt makes the Africa question impossible to wave away. Deuteronomy chapter 28. This chapter is famous for a reason. It reads like a warning written in advance. It describes what would happen to the people if the covenant broke, and one of the things it describes is scattering. Verse 64, scattered among all peoples, from one end of the earth to the other. From one end of the earth to the other, not exiled to one city, scattered across the whole world. And then comes verse 68, and this is the line that stops people cold. It says they would be brought into Egypt again, by ships. By ships. Sit with that image for 1 second. A people, described thousands of years ago, being carried back toward Africa, not walking, not marching in a line across the desert like the old deportations, but by sea, in ships, against their will, into bondage. Now, I'm not going to tell you what to feel when you read that. I said I'd keep this straight down the middle, and I will. There's a fierce debate about what that verse is describing and when. But I'll say this much. For a whole lot of people, the first time they read into Egypt again by ships, something in their chest went quiet. Because they'd heard about ships before. They'd heard about a crossing before. And it wasn't in a history class about the ancient world. That's a conversation the comment section is going to have, with or without me. So let's have it out loud. When you read a line about a scattered people carried across the water in ships into bondage, what's the first thing that comes to your mind? Tell me down below. I read them. And your tribe, wherever your line runs, was that your family on those roads? Keep it in your pocket. We're building toward the whole picture.
So let's talk about why I keep calling this the map they hid. Because I don't want you picturing some cartoon villain in a dark room. Here's what actually erases a map. Empires erase maps. When Assyria emptied the north and moved strangers in, they weren't just taking land, they were taking memory. Scatter a people and replace them, and within 2 generations, nobody remembers who was there first. Time erases maps. Records rot. Cities burn. Libraries are lost. The further back you go, the more of the trail simply crumbles. And the slave trade erased maps, brutally, deliberately, and on an industrial scale. When human beings were carried across the ocean, the first thing taken from them wasn't their labor, it was their name, their language, their lineage. The systems of that era were built to break the chain of memory, so a person could not tell you where they came from, what tribe they belonged to, or what their ancestors were called. That's not a conspiracy theory, that's documented history. Historians don't argue about whether it happened, they argue about how much survived it. So when I say the map they hid, I don't mean a secret society with a candle. I mean this. Conquest and time and the deliberate machinery of erasure took a story that was once written in plain sight, Egypt, Pathros, Cush, scattered to the ends of the earth, carried in ships, and tore it into 1,000 pieces, and scattered the pieces so wide that no one could see the shape anymore. Our job right now is to pick the pieces back up. So let's follow the trail into Africa, not with imagination, but with the receipts. Corridor number 1, Egypt. Start with the prophets who watched the collapse in real time. Amos and Hosea both preached to the northern kingdom before it fell. Both described a people about to be uprooted. Both belong to this story as eyewitnesses to the beginning of the scattering. Then move south to Judah and open Jeremiah, chapters 43 and 44. This is documented flight. After Jerusalem fell to Babylon, a group of survivors from Judah didn't go east into exile. They ran the other way, south, into Egypt. Jeremiah names the towns they settled in. He names Pathros, that same deep southern Egypt Isaiah named. So we're not guessing here. We have a named group of Israelites in a named book moving into Africa and settling there. And that community was not small, and it was not brief. There's a documented Israelite presence living in Egypt for centuries. Soldiers, families, whole settlements along the Nile, with their own life and their own worship, long after the flight Jeremiah described. Historians have the records. This is one of the places the trail is not faint at all. It's solid ground. Israelites lived in Africa. That much is not up for debate. So one road out of Jerusalem leads straight down the Nile, and it does not stop at the border of the map they gave you in school. Now, whose road was that? Judah's line was in that flight. Benjamin, Levi. If your name traces back to the southern kingdom, that Egyptian corridor is your corridor. What about your tribe? Hold it. Corridor number 2. Cush, Ethiopia, and Sudan. Follow the Nile past Egypt, and you reach the ancient kingdom the texts call Cush, a powerful African civilization in its own right, in the land of Nubia, reaching into modern Sudan and Ethiopia. Cush is not a footnote in these scriptures. It's named again and again. It's in Isaiah's gathering list. It sits at the crossroads of every route between the Middle East and the African interior. And this is the corridor where an Israelite presence in the Horn of Africa runs so deep that it became its own famous chapter of history, a chapter this channel has already covered on its own, so I'm not going to retell it here. If you want the full story of the Israelite communities of Ethiopia, I've got a whole video on it. The link is right up there and down in the description. Go watch it after this. For our map, all you need is the road. It's the hinge.
It's the place where the trail out of the Middle East swings from Africa's doorstep to deep inside Africa. Past Kush, you're not near Africa anymore. You're in it. And the routes keep going, south along the Nile and west into the vast belt of grassland that runs clear across the continent, which brings us to the longest road on the map and the one they came closest to erasing completely. Corridor number 3, the road west. Here's where I have to change my footing, and I'll tell you when I do it, because I promised you'd always know the difference between solid ground and open water. The Egypt corridor, solid. The Kush corridor, solid. But the road west, across the width of Africa, into the Sahel and toward the Atlantic coast, that's where the documented record thins out and tradition takes over. This is the part scholars fight about hardest, and I'm not going to pretend the paper trail is thick here as it is along the Nile. It isn't. Anybody who tells you otherwise is selling you something. But thin is not the same as empty, because all the way across West Africa there are communities this channel has covered one by one in their own videos, who carry traditions of ancient Israelite descent, naming customs, rituals, old stories passed down that they came from the East long ago, from a land beyond the desert. I'm not going to retell each one of those communities here, because each one already has its own full episode on this channel. I'll drop the playlist so you can go through them yourself. What matters for the map is the pattern. One or two communities claiming an ancient migration from the East, that's a curiosity. But a chain of them spread across the whole width of the continent, all telling a version of the same story, all sitting along the same natural routes that traders and travelers used for thousands of years, that starts to look less like a coincidence and more like a road. Follow that road far enough and you reach the western edge of Africa, the coast, and that's where the last corridor begins, the one over water. So, your tribe, if the long road west is the one your ancestors walked, then your story crossed a continent before it ever crossed an ocean. What about your tribe? Almost there. Hold on. Corridor 4 is the shortest to describe and the heaviest to carry. The Atlantic. I told you Deuteronomy 28 said, "Into Egypt again by ships." And I told you the machinery of the slave trade was built to erase exactly the kind of memory we're trying to rebuild tonight. Put those two things next to each other, and you understand why so many people, when they finally assemble this map, stop breathing for a second. Because the transatlantic crossing is not a theory. It's one of the most heavily documented forced migrations in human history. Millions of Africans carried across the ocean in ships into bondage, their names and their lineages stripped away by design. Now here's the honest line I have to draw one more time, because it's the fairest thing I can do for you. That the crossing happened, documented, undeniable. That the people carried across it were specifically the scattered tribes of Israel, closing the loop Isaiah and Deuteronomy opened, that is the claim. That's the interpretation. That's the part real historians debate in real journals. They don't all agree, and I'm not going to stand here and tell you the argument is over when it isn't. But I'll tell you why the claim refuses to die. Because the shape of it fits. A people scattered to the ends of the earth, a trail that runs down into Egypt, through Kush, across Africa to the Western Sea, and then a crossing by ships into bondage in a new land where the first thing taken was the memory of who they were. Read it as history, read it as prophecy, read it as coincidence, but you can't say you weren't shown the shape. So that's the last road. And now finally, we can put the whole thing on one page. This is the part no single video on this channel has ever done. Everybody's shown you one corner, one community, one ship's manifest, one verse. Tonight, we put all 12 roads on the same map for the first time. Ready? Watch the shape form. You start in Jerusalem, one city, 12 tribes. The kingdom splits, Judah, Benjamin, and Levi in the south, the other 10 in the north. The north falls to Assyria. The 10 tribes are marched off, east at first, into Mesopotamia. That's road 1, and it goes the wrong way. But roads bend, and time moves, and scattered people keep moving. Then Isaiah names the gathering places, and 3 of them are Egypt, Pathros, and Cush. The map turns south. The south falls to Babylon, and a documented group of survivors runs the other way, into Egypt, into Pathros, and stays for centuries. That's road 2, and it lands squarely in Africa. From Egypt, the trail follows the Nile into Cush, Sudan, Ethiopia, the Horn, where an Israelite presence runs so deep it became legendary. That's the hinge. From Cush, the routes fan out, south and west, across the grassland belt of the whole continent, marked by a chain of communities all telling a version of the same Eastern origin story. That's the long road. And at the western edge of that road, the ocean, the crossing, by ships, into bondage, exactly the words Deuteronomy put on the page thousands of years earlier. Now step back and look at what you just drew. 12 roads, every one of them, no matter where it starts, bends the same direction, down, into Africa, across Africa, and for a great many of them, out the far side, over the water, into the Americas. That's the map. That's the whole map. And here's the thing that gets people. It was never really hidden in the sense of being locked in a vault. Every piece was sitting in plain sight. The verses were in the most printed book on earth. The Egyptian settlements were in the archaeological record. The African communities were telling their stories out loud the whole time. The crossing was documented in 1,000 ledgers. It wasn't hidden. It was scattered, torn into pieces and spread so wide that you were never supposed to hold all the pieces at once. Well, you're holding them now.
So let me leave you with the honest bottom line, because you deserve it and because it's the thing that'll get people talking. Is this proven, beyond argument, court of law certain? No. And anyone who tells you it is has stopped doing history and started doing sales. Parts of this map are bedrock, the conquests, the Egyptian settlements, the crossing. Other parts are tradition and interpretation stretched across gaps in the record, and reasonable people, including serious scholars, line up on different sides. But here's what I'll stand behind. The receipts are real. Isaiah 11:11 names Egypt, Pathros, and Cush. You can read it tonight. 2 Kings 17 documents the emptying of the north. Deuteronomy 28 says scattered to the ends of the earth and carried into bondage by ships. Jeremiah 43 and 44 put a named group of Israelites on the road into Africa. Those aren't things I made up in a studio. Those are things somebody wrote down and preserved and could never quite erase. And maybe that's the real ending. They scattered the people, they scattered the records, they scattered the memory across 3 continents and an ocean. They did almost everything right if erasing a bloodline was the goal, but they missed one thing. They couldn't burn all the receipts. A verse survives, a settlement survives, a story survives around a fire on the far side of a desert. And as long as one piece survives, the map can be rebuilt, which is exactly what we just did. So now it's your turn, and I mean this. Somewhere in that map is a road that belongs to you. Maybe your line runs back to Judah in the flight down the Nile. Maybe Ephraim or Manasseh out on the long road west. Maybe Dan, maybe Naphtali, maybe Gad, marched off by Assyria before the map even bent south. Maybe you don't know yet,
And if that's you, I've got a whole separate video breaking down how people trace which tribe they may descend from. That's not tonight's story, so I won't redo it here, but the link is up there and in the description. Go find your road, and then come back and tell me. Drop the name of your tribe in the comments right now. Judah, Levi, Benjamin, Reuben, Simeon, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Issachar, Zebulun, Ephraim, Manasseh. Just the name. Let's see how many of the 12 show up in one comment section. Let's see if we can put the family back on one page right here tonight. Because they tore the map into 12 pieces and scattered it to the ends of the earth, but we're the ones holding the pieces now. And your piece, the road that ends with you, that's the one they never counted on. So which tribe are you? Tell me. I'll be reading every single one.